The grand resonant chamber of the glyptal conclave was a space carved from silence and starlight. Crystalline pillars, grown over eons from the solidified thoughts of its architects, rose into a vaulted darkness where captured nebulae swirled in a slow, majestic dance. Light was the language here, shifting in color and intensity, pulsing through the very structure of the hall in waves of meaning. It was a place of immense antiquity, where decisions that shaped the spiral arm were made not with sound, but with the pure, cold logic of harmonic frequencies. Yet, for the first time in 1,000 cycles, the light in the chamber was dissonant, flickering with the ugly, chaotic shades of fear. At the heart of this disharmony was a single, maddening enigma: humanity. Prime Resonator Xyler, whose multifaceted form absorbed and refracted the anxious light of the debate, felt the discord as a physical pressure against his crystalline lattice. His consciousness, a being of stable, ordered energy, felt frayed by the proceedings. He stood at the apex of the conclave, a council of species bound by a shared desire for cosmic stability, and that stability was now threatened by a ghost. A phantom that had emerged from a forgotten corner of the galaxy, blazed with a brief, violent fire, and then vanished behind a veil of impenetrable silence. Their silence is the act of a predator, pulsed Strategos Kalen, his form a sharp obsidian shard in contrast to the more translucent glyptals. Kalen was of the Vex, a species forged in the gravity wells of dying stars, and they saw the universe as an eternal battlefield of force and attrition. His light was a sharp, piercing crimson. They retreat to sharpen their claws, they withdraw to forge their weapons. We have seen this pattern before in the nascent stages of 100 fallen empires. They are gathering strength in that shroud they have woven around their cradle system. Every sensor we direct at it is blinded, every probe is lost. This is not the behavior of a species in decline. It is the act of a culture preparing for total war. The crimson light of Kalen's assertion washed over the chamber, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled consciousnesses, a cascade of anxious violet and worried amber. The Sol Shroud, as it had been designated, was a statistical impossibility, a region of space so utterly opaque to external observation that it defied all known physics. For generations, it had been a mere curiosity, the quiet tomb of a species that had burned too brightly and collapsed into savagery or extinction, as so many had before. But recent gravitational readings, subtle at first, then undeniably significant, had transformed the curiosity into a source of profound dread. Something was moving in the dark, something massive. Your interpretation is predicated on a logic of conquest, Strategos, countered a soft, cyan glow from across the chamber. This was Archivist Lyra, a being whose form was a delicate, swirling composite of light and memory, her glyptal structure infused with the archived knowledge of millennia. You see a predator because you are a predator. But our records of early human contact, fragmented as they are, speak not only of aggression but also of immense creativity, of profound empathy, of a capacity for self-reflection that is almost unparalleled. They were chaotic, yes. A fever species, as the old designation stated. But a fever can break, leaving the patient stronger, or it can lead to a transformation we cannot yet comprehend. Lyra's cyan light was soothing, a wave of cool reason against Kalen's fire. To act preemptively is to risk creating the very enemy we fear. We are the Glyptal Conclave. Our purpose is to preserve the great stasis, the cosmic balance that has allowed life to flourish under our watch. Lashing out at an unknown based on fear and assumption is the antithesis of that purpose. It is the action of a lesser, more primitive power. Xyler resonated a deep, stabilizing indigo calling for order. His own thoughts were a maelstrom, a conflict between the chilling logic of Kalen's position and the hopeful wisdom of Lyra's. He remembered the first contact reports, centuries old. He had studied them as a young resonator, a case study in cosmic failure. The humans had exploded onto the galactic stage with bewildering speed. Their technology was crude, their politics a cacophony of warring tribes, their emotions a raw, untamed force that bled into their transmissions. They were brilliant and broken, compassionate and cruel, all in the same breath. The Conclave had observed them, classified them as a non-imminent but potentially disruptive force, and then almost as quickly as they appeared, they had vanished. They had pulled back to their home star, system by system, until all contact ceased, and then the shroud had formed. For a long time, the Conclave believed they had simply destroyed themselves. It was the most logical outcome for such a volatile species, a final, spectacular act of self-immolation. But the new data suggested a different, more terrifying possibility. The gravitational anomalies were not the echoes of a dead system. They were the workings of a living one on a scale that strained the imagination. The energy signatures, when they could be glimpsed through fleeting gaps in the shroud, spoke of stellar engineering, of matter-energy conversion on a planetary scale. It was quiet, but it was the quiet of a colossal engine idling. "What would you have us do, Archivist?" Kalen's light sharpened. "Wait until the shroud dissolves to reveal a fleet of warships that eclipses our own. Wait until a wave of incomprehensible weaponry washes over our outer colonies. Logic dictates we assess the threat, and the only way to assess a sealed container is to open it. We must send the Grand Fleet. We will approach with a posture of authority, demand they reveal themselves. If they are peaceful, they will comply. If they are hostile, we will have the means to cauterize the infection before it spreads." "A fleet is a declaration of intent, strateges," Lyra pulsed back, her cyan light holding firm. "It invites conflict. It forces a response in kind. Send a single vessel, an archive ship. Let our first gesture be one of peace and offering of knowledge. We will tell them of the galaxy as it is now, of the great stasis we have maintained. We will invite them to join the galactic community, not as a potential enemy, but as a long-lost member returning to the fold. Their response to such a gesture will tell us more about their nature than 1,000 warships ever could." The debate raged, a silent storm of light and logic. The chamber thrummed with the weight of consequence. To the Vex and their allies, Lyra's proposal was naive, a dangerous gamble that risked everything on the presumed goodwill of a species known for its irrationality. To the archivists, the diplomats, and the ancient, contemplative species, Kalen's plan was a crude act of barbarism, a betrayal of the Conclave's highest principles. Xyler let the waves of argument wash over him, his consciousness reaching deep into the crystalline heart of the chamber, drawing on the accumulated wisdom of his predecessors. He felt the cold touch of their ancient fears. The Conclave had faced threats before, swarm intelligences that consumed stars, machine empires that sought to digitize all life, fanatical zealots on crusades of cosmic purification. They had endured, they had balanced, they had preserved, but humanity was different. They were not a monolithic entity with a single, predictable goal. They were a paradox. They were a species that could create transcendent art and commit unspeakable atrocities. They could love with a ferocity that defied logic and hate with a passion that consumed worlds. They were, in a word, unknowable. And that was what truly terrified the Conclave. They were a variable in the grand equation that could not be solved. His own internal conflict was a mirror of the chamber's debate. The prime resonator in him, the guardian of stability, felt the pull of Kalen's grim pragmatism. The scholar in him, the part that had always been fascinated by the sheer, beautiful chaos of life, resonated with Lyra's plea for understanding. He knew that this decision would define his legacy, and perhaps the future of the galaxy itself. To act with aggression was to risk a war of unimaginable scale. To act with peace was to risk being devoured by a threat they had willingly invited to their doorstep. As the debate reached an impasse, a new light pulsed from the chamber's central data spire. It was not part of the discussion. It was a cold, pure white, the color of raw information, an alert of the highest priority. The chamber fell into an expectant silence, the chaotic colors of argument instantly extinguished. Every consciousness focused on the spire. The alert was from the deep-range sensor arrays at the galactic core. They had been monitoring the Sol shroud for decades, patiently listening for any whisper of activity. For all that time, there had been nothing but the low hum of immense, contained energy. Now there was a signal. It was not a communication. It was a change of state. A single, colossal gravitational wave had just been released from the center of the shroud. It was not an explosion. It was controlled, focused, and impossibly powerful. It was the gravitational signature of an object with the mass of a terrestrial planet making a sudden, deliberate change in velocity. The Conclave's most sophisticated models could not process the data. It was like watching a mountain stand up and walk. A chilling wave of pure terror, a color so dark it was almost black, rippled through the chamber. The theoretical had become real. The ghost in the dark had moved. Xyler's indecision shattered. There was no more time for debate. A decision had to be made now. He drew upon the full authority of his office, his own light flaring into a brilliant, commanding gold that dominated the chamber and forced all others into submission. "We will not be ruled by fear," his resonance declared, the statement echoing through the crystalline structure of the hall. "Nor will we be blinded by hope. We will embrace both caution and curiosity. Archivist Lyra, you will prepare your diplomatic vessel, the Stellark. You will be our envoy. You will carry an archive of peace and an invitation to dialogue. A wave of relieved cyan pulsed from Lyra's position. "Strategos Kalen," Xyler continued, his golden light hardening as it turned to the obsidian shard. "You will assemble a grand fleet, not to engage but to observe. You will escort the Stellark to the edge of the shroud. Your fleet will be our shield. You will remain cloaked, a hidden testament to our strength, but you will not, under any circumstances, reveal your presence or take hostile action unless the envoy is attacked. You are a guardian, not an executioner. You understand?" Kalen's crimson light flickered, a moment of protest, but it was quickly subsumed by the authority of the Prime Resonator's command. A reluctant, deep red of acceptance pulsed in reply. "Go," Xyler commanded, his golden light filling every corner of the vast chamber. "Confront this silence. Bring us back the truth of what humanity has become." The conclave dissolved, the beings of light and form receding into the shadowed alcoves of the great hall, leaving Xyler alone with the swirling nebulae above. The fear in the chamber had not vanished. It had simply been focused into a single, terrifying point, the tip of a diplomatic spear, backed by a silent, invisible sword, aimed at the heart of the greatest mystery the galaxy had ever known. Xyler watched the ghost galaxy spin, and for the first time in his long existence, he felt the cold, unfamiliar touch of profound uncertainty. He had sent his pieces onto the board, but he had no way of knowing the rules of the game his opponent was playing. The journey to the Sol Shroud was a voyage through a graveyard of galactic ambition. The conclave fleet, a river of polished chrome and dark, weaponized alloys, moved in perfect, silent formation through the void. They passed the shattered ring worlds of the Siren hegemony, the glassed planets of the Cathar Dominion, and the silent, drifting monoliths of the Firstborn, all empires that had risen and fallen, their stories ending in fire and ruin. It was a constant reminder to Strategos Kalen of the price of miscalculation. He stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Indomitus, a vessel whose very architecture was a monument to Vex martial philosophy. The bridge was not a place of comfort, but a nerve center of cold, hard data, displaying tactical projections and energy readings on floating walls of crimson light. From his position at the heart of the fleet, he could feel the presence of his warships, not as a count but as a weight, a gravitational certainty. It was a force that had pacified entire sectors, a power that had brought recalcitrant species into the fold of the great stasis. And yet, as they drew closer to the human system, that certainty began to erode, replaced by a growing disquiet. The space ahead felt empty. Not the normal emptiness of the void, but a curated, artificial emptiness. There were no stray comets, no rogue asteroids, no interstellar dust clouds. The region around the shroud had been swept clean. Lyra, aboard the Stellark, felt the same emptiness, but she interpreted it differently. From the observation dome of her archive ship, a vessel designed for study and peaceful contact, she saw not a sterile void, but a carefully prepared space. It was like the cleared ground before the entrance to a great temple. Her vessel was small, elegant, and unarmed, a single mote of light against the backdrop of the hidden, watching fleet. Her mission was to be the voice of reason, the extended hand of diplomacy. She spent the journey in deep communion with the archives, studying the perplexing fragments of human history, art, and philosophy. She saw their contradictions laid bare, sonnets of profound love written by the same species that had perfected industrial slaughter. Symphonies of heartbreaking beauty composed alongside treatises on weapons of mass destruction. They were a species that dreamed of angels while wrestling with demons. As they reached the designated coordinates, the Sol Shroud filled their viewports. It was not a nebula of gas and dust as they had expected. It was a perfectly spherical barrier of absolute blackness, absorbing all light, all sensor pings, all radiation. It did not reflect, it consumed. It was a hole in the fabric of reality, a sphere of utter nothingness centered on the human star. The sheer geometric perfection of it was terrifying. Nature did not create such things. This was artifice. An act of engineering on a scale so vast it bordered on the divine. Kalen's fleet settled into cloaked formation, a ring of unseen predators circling the silent sphere. The Stellark drifted forward alone, a tiny, brave vessel approaching the maw of the unknown. As instructed, Lyra broadcast the conclave's standard greeting of peace, a complex sequence of mathematics, physics, and harmonic resonance that was universally understood by all spacefaring life. She sent the signal, the sum of the conclave's knowledge and an invitation to peaceful discourse, into the silent blackness. For a long, tense moment, there was no reply. The void remained inert. On the bridge of the Indomitus, Kalen's hand equivalent tensed. His tactical mind screamed that this was a trap. The silence was the drawing of a breath before the kill. Then something happened. Not a transmission, not a weapon firing, but a change in the shroud itself. A perfect circular section of the blackness directly in front of the stellark began to thin. It did not dissipate or explode. It simply became transparent, the starfield on the other side bleeding through. A perfect circular gateway had opened in the impenetrable wall, a silent invitation. "By the first stars," Lyra whispered, her light pulsing with a soft, awestruck scion. "Hold your position, Archivist," Kaelin's voice, tight with suspicion, crackled over the comm. "This could be a tactic to separate you from the fleet." "It is an answer, strategos," Lyra replied, her voice calm and steady. "They have chosen to respond not with words but with an act of trust. To refuse it would be an insult. I am proceeding." Without waiting for his protest, the stellark glided forward, crossing the threshold into the human system. As the ship passed through, the gateway behind it sealed, the perfect blackness flowing back into place. Lyra and her crew were cut off, alone. The space within the shroud was even more astonishing than the barrier that contained it. The star, Sol, burned at the center, but it was not a wild, untamed fusion reactor. It was caged. A vast, intricate lattice of black and silver structures, a Dyson sphere in its early stages of construction, surrounded the star, capturing a significant portion of its energy and directing it outwards in focused beams. The planets of the inner system were gone, not destroyed but deconstructed. In their place were colossal orbital rings, habitats of impossible size, their inner surfaces glowing with the light of artificial suns, revealing continents of green and blue. Swarms of smaller habitats and industrial forges drifted between the rings, all connected by streams of shimmering light that were clearly transportation conduits. This was not a planetary civilization. This was a civilization that had consumed its own solar system and rebuilt it to its own design. It was a work of breathtaking, terrifying ambition. As the stellark drifted through this majestic, silent clockwork, a single vessel detached itself from one of the orbital rings and moved to intercept them. It was small, sleek, and utterly unadorned, a simple teardrop of a silver-gray metal. It broadcast no weapon signatures, no defensive shields. It simply approached and positioned itself a respectful distance from the conclave ship. A channel opened. There was no static, no negotiation of protocols. It was a pure, direct connection. And then a voice spoke. It was a female voice, calm, measured, and speaking the conclave's primary trade language with flawless, unaccented precision. "Welcome to Sol. I am Emissary Eva. We have received your message. We thank you for your offer of knowledge. We are prepared to listen." On the bridge of the stellark, Lyra and her crew were stunned into silence. They had expected primitive signals, a difficult translation process, perhaps even a hostile challenge. They had not expected this serene, effortless professionalism. "I am Archivist Lyra of the Glyptal Conclave," Lyra finally responded, her own light patterns struggling to remain calm. "We come in peace, Emissary Eva. We wish to understand what has become of your people. The galaxy has known only your silence for a very long time." "Our silence was necessary," the human voice replied without a hint of defensiveness. It was a simple statement of fact. "We had internal matters to resolve. We observed the galaxy. We saw the patterns, the rise and fall of empires, the cycles of violence, the great stasis you have worked so hard to maintain. We concluded that we were not yet ready to participate. To do so would have been to repeat the mistakes of the past." This statement struck Lyra with the force of a physical blow. It was an act of civilizational introspection on a scale she had never imagined. A species that had willingly quarantined itself for centuries, not out of fear, but out of a sense of profound ethical responsibility. "So you withdrew," Lyra pulsed, her curiosity overriding her apprehension. "You built all of this for what purpose?" "To solve the problems of our own nature," Eva said. "Scarcity, conflict, mortality, the fundamental drivers of empire and aggression. We chose to turn our gaze inward to re-engineer our society before we presumed to engage with others. We have been busy." The understatement was so profound it was almost comical. Aboard the Indomitus, Kaelin and his command staff listened to the exchange, their tactical displays showing nothing but the single, non-threatening human ship. He felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with military threat. This was something else, a kind of strategic and philosophical depth he had never encountered. The humans weren't primitive. They weren't savages sharpening their spears in a cave. They were philosophers who had built a fortress of unparalleled scale to protect their contemplation. "And your defenses," Kalen couldn't resist. He broke protocol, his own voice cutting into the channel, a sharp, grating intrusion. You cannot expect the Conclave to believe you have undertaken such a vast project without the means to protect it. Show us your fleet. There was a pause. For the first time, a flicker of something new entered the human's tone. It was not anger or fear. It was weariness, a profound, ancient exhaustion. Strategos Kalen of the Vex, Eva's voice returned, perfectly identifying him without any introduction. We have been monitoring your fleet since it entered the periphery of our system. Your cloak is quite effective against most sensor technologies, not all of them. A wave of cold shock washed through the bridge of the Indomitus. The blood-red light seemed to dim. His entire fleet, the pride of the Conclave, the ultimate expression of its power, had been watched from the moment they arrived. They had thought themselves the silent observers, but they had been the observed all along. Your assumption is that power must be expressed through a multitude of hulls, Eva continued, her voice still calm, but now with an edge of something that sounded like pity. That strength is measured in the number of ships you can bring to bear. It is a limited, inefficient philosophy. We chose a different path. Show us, Kalen repeated, his voice now a low growl of pure menace. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. His threat was being met with calm, dispassionate analysis. Very well, Eva said, the weariness in her voice deepening. If a demonstration of force is what is required for this dialogue to proceed, then we will provide it. Follow me, Archivist Lyra. Strategos, you are welcome to watch. The small, silver ship turned and began to move, not towards the orbital rings or the Dyson sphere, but deeper into the system, towards one of the outer planets. It was a gas giant, a colossal ball of swirling hydrogen and helium, unremarkable save for its size. The Stellark followed, with Lyra's crew watching in tense silence. On Kalen's bridge, every sensor of the cloaked fleet was focused on the event, straining to find any sign of a trap. As they approached the gas giant, Eva's voice returned. For a long time, we debated the ethics of power. How could we ensure our own safety without becoming a threat to others? How could we possess a sword large enough to deter any aggressor, but never be tempted to use it for conquest? This was our solution. The human ship stopped, and then the planet began to change. It started with the clouds. The swirling bands of orange and white began to move in unnatural ways, spinning faster, then pulling back like a curtain. Beneath them was not a planetary core, but a solid surface of dark, metallic gray, etched with lines so vast they looked like canyons. Then the surface itself began to move. Entire continents of the metal shifted, retracting into the planet's interior, revealing a glowing, intricate superstructure beneath. It was not a planet. It had never been a planet. It was a disguise. A shell of gas and atmospheric generators built around a machine of incomprehensible scale. Aboard the Indomitus, the sensor arrays screamed. The energy readings were off the scale. The gravitational displacement was equivalent to a small moon. Kalen and his crew could only stare, their martial pride, their entire conception of warfare, shattering into a million pieces. From the depths of the machine world, colossal structures began to emerge. Engines the size of planets themselves, ignited with a silent, brilliant blue-white light, their glow so intense it outshone the distant, caged sun. Along the equator of the sphere, a trench opened, miles deep, and from it rose the barrels of weapons so large that the Conclave's mightiest battleships would be like dust motes in their sights. The entire planet was a single, integrated weapon, a single warship. You asked to see our fleet, Strategos, Eva's voice echoed in the stunned silence, now imbued with a terrible, sorrowful gravity. We have no fleet. We built only one ship. We call it Sentinel. It is our guardian, our deterrent, and our profoundest regret. It is the physical manifestation of our commitment to never again be forced into a war we do not choose. We built this so that we would never have to build another. Now, please, let us speak of peace. For we have shown you what our alternative looks like. The Sentinel hung in the void, a world-sized statement of absolute, irrefutable power. It did not threaten. It did not posture. It simply existed. And in its existence, it rendered every fleet, every army, every empire in the galaxy utterly and completely obsolete. On the bridge of the Indomitus, Strategos Kalen slowly lowered himself into his command chair, the sharp crimson lights of his bridge reflecting off his obsidian form. For the first time in his life, the universe's most dedicated warrior felt the true, paralyzing, and humbling meaning of the word checkmate. The silence of humanity had not been the silence of a predator sharpening its claws. It had been the silence of a god forging a thunderbolt. The silence that followed the revelation of the Sentinel was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence born not of absence, but of overwhelming presence. Aboard the flagship of the Grand Fleet, Strategos Kalen did not move for a long time. The crimson light of his bridge, once a symbol of Vex power and aggression, now seemed like a dim, fading ember in the face of the star-dwarfing engine glow of the human warship. His entire philosophy, built upon the principle of overwhelming force, had been rendered meaningless. How could one overwhelm a force that occupied the very definition of the word? He had brought a sword to a contest of mountains. Archivist Lyra, from the observation dome of the Stellark, felt not fear but a deep, resonant awe. It was the awe of a scholar discovering a new, fundamental law of the universe. The humans had not simply built a bigger weapon. They had transcended the very concept of warfare as the Conclave understood it. The Sentinel was not a tool for conquest. A weapon that large was useless for occupying planets or subjugating populations. It was too absolute. Its only conceivable purpose was the one emissary Eva had stated, to end conflict before it could begin. It was a statement of power so definitive that it made all other statements irrelevant. It was a weapon designed to enforce peace. Slowly, Kalen rose. He transmitted a single command to his fleet, a code that had not been used in generations, reserved for a scenario his people had only ever theorized, the encountering of a transcendent power. In unison, the entire Grand Fleet deactivated their cloaking fields. A river of warships, an armada that could cow a quadrant of the galaxy, materialized from the void. They did not power their weapons. They did not raise their shields. Instead, they reoriented their hulls one by one into a posture of ceremonial deference, a salute reserved for a victorious superior. It was the ultimate gesture of surrender, offered without a single shot being fired. Eva's voice returned, and this time the weariness was gone, replaced by a soft, gentle tone that held a hint of relief. "That is a wise decision, Strategos. Thank you. Now, Archivist Lyra, we invite you to join us. There is much to discuss." The diplomatic exchange that followed was unlike any in the Conclave's history. Lyra and her team were brought aboard one of the colossal orbital rings, a world in itself, with soaring silver towers, forests that grew under a simulated sky, and oceans held in place by shimmering fields of energy. There they met Eva in person and other humans. They were unremarkable. They were soft-skinned, fragile-looking beings, their faces a canvas for 1,000 fleeting emotions that the glyptals could barely interpret. Yet they moved with a quiet confidence, a serene purpose that was utterly at odds with the chaotic, aggressive species described in the Conclave's old records. They explained their history, the Great Reflection, as they called it. After their brief, violent expansion into the galaxy, they had been horrified by their own nature. They saw their tribalism, their greed, their capacity for violence, and they knew that if they continued on that path, they would become just another fallen empire, another layer of dust and ruin in the galactic graveyard. So they had turned back. They had used their fierce, restless ingenuity not to conquer the stars, but to conquer themselves. They had rewritten their genetics to curb their aggression, developed economic systems that eliminated scarcity, and created a unified global consciousness, a network of minds that allowed for deep, empathetic understanding without sacrificing individuality. They had not become a hive mind, but something far more nuanced, a truly communal species. The Sentinel, they explained, was the final part of that process. It was their great burden. Forged from the matter of their inner planets, it was a constant, terrifying reminder of their own potential for destruction. Every human was connected to it, felt its immense sleeping power. It was a self-imposed cage, a promise to the universe that they would never again unleash their untamed nature upon it. They had built a god machine and had sworn themselves to its service, a service of peace and restraint. Xyler, observing all of this from the grand resonant chamber light years away, felt the entire foundation of the Conclave's worldview crumble. The Conclave sought to impose stability on the galaxy through external control, through fleets and treaties and the careful management of lesser species. The humans had achieved a far more profound stability by mastering themselves. They had not solved the equation of the universe. They had solved the equation of their own soul. He proposed a new treaty, not an integration of humanity into the Conclave, but a partnership, an alliance of equals. The Conclave, with its ancient wisdom, its vast network of species, and its millennia of galactic experience, and humanity, with its profound internal focus, its unparalleled technology, and its terrifying, silent guardian. Together, they could guide the galaxy into a new era, one based not on the suppression of conflict, but on the cultivation of wisdom. The humans agreed. They had no interest in leading or ruling, only in participating and learning. They sought a quiet galaxy, one where other species could have the time and the peace to undertake their own great reflections, to find their own balance. The alliance was formalized in a ceremony broadcast across 1,000 worlds. The Stellark and Eva's small silver ship floated side by side in the shadow of the Sentinel, which had partially recloaked itself in its planetary disguise, a gesture of humility. Strategos Kalen stood beside Archivist Lyra, his obsidian form next to her cyan glow, a living symbol of the new unity between martial power and diplomatic wisdom. It was a moment of unprecedented hope, the dawn of a golden age. It was during this ceremony, as the final accords were being transmitted, that the twist came. It was not a betrayal. It was not a secret act of aggression. It was a quiet alert appearing on a human display, unseen by the conclave representatives. Emissary Eva's calm expression faltered, just for a moment. A flicker of deep, deep concern crossed her features, a micro-expression so fleeting that only a being trained in the subtleties of human emotion would have noticed it. She turned to a floating screen of light that only she could see. Xyler, linked to Lyra through a quantum communicator, felt the shift in the atmosphere. "Emissary Eva," he resonated through his envoy. "Is there a problem?" Eva turned back to them, her composure regained, but her eyes held a new depth, a shadow that had not been there before. "The Sentinel is more than a weapon," she said, her voice low and serious. "It is also our most powerful sensor array. Its purpose is not just to watch our neighbors, but to listen to the cosmos. For the entirety of our isolation, we have been listening, not just to the noise of the galaxy, but to the silence between them." She gestured, and a new image appeared between the ships, a vast, three-dimensional map of their local galactic cluster. Dozens of galaxies, including their own, were represented as swirling islands of light. "We detected it a century ago," Eva continued. "A subtle, repeating pattern hidden deep in the background radiation of the universe. It is not a natural phenomenon. It is artificial, and it is incredibly ancient." She zoomed the map in on the void between galaxies, the vast, dark oceans of intergalactic space. Here and there, the map was wrong. There were patches of impossible darkness, regions where the faint glow of distant galaxies was simply gone, as if erased. "The signal is a carrier wave for a simple, brutal message," Eva said, her voice now stripped of all diplomatic warmth, replaced by a cold, clinical gravity. "It's a pattern, a sequence, and it's not random. In every cycle, a specific coordinate is broadcast, followed by a period of intense energy emission from that coordinate, and then silence. The stars at that location simply vanish, not just the stars, the entire galaxy." On the display, a point of light flashed in one of the dark, empty zones, then another, and another. A horrifying pattern emerged, a slow, methodical march of cosmic extinction, moving from one galaxy to the next. "It is not a conquest," Eva stated, her eyes fixed on the terrible map. "It is a harvest, or perhaps a cleansing. Something is moving through the intergalactic void, and it is consuming galaxies. The dark patches you see are the places it has already been." A cold dread, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over Xyler's consciousness. The Conclave had spent eons worrying about pirates and petty empires, about the squabbles of ambitious species. They had been like children arguing over colored stones on a beach, oblivious to the tsunami rising over the horizon. "The signal we are receiving has changed," Eva said, her gaze finally meeting Lyra's. "For the first time, the coordinates it is broadcasting are not in a distant cluster. They are inside our own. It has designated a target galaxy for its next cycle." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "It is broadcasting the coordinates of your neighbor, the Andromeda Galaxy." The map shifted, showing their own Milky Way and the great spiral of Andromeda, separated by a gulf of 2.5 million light-years. An arrow of cold, red light appeared, originating from the deep void, pointing directly at Andromeda. "And the signal is not just a broadcast anymore," Eva finished, her voice a near whisper. "It has become a countdown. Based on its velocity and the time between cycles, the harvesting entity will arrive at Andromeda in approximately 500 of your standard years." 500 years, a blink of an eye in the lifespan of the Glyptal. The empires of their galaxy had not fallen because humanity rose. They would fall because they were an irrelevance. Humanity's rise, their great reflection, their impossible weapon, it had never been about their neighbors. It had been about this. Their silence wasn't a retreat from the galaxy, it was a preparation to defend it. Prime Resonator Xyler stood in his silent chamber, the light from the ceremony feed painting his crystalline form in the hopeful colors of the new alliance. But his own consciousness was filled with the cold, black dread of the map Eva had shown. He had feared humanity as a potential destroyer, a chaotic variable that would shatter his perfect equation. He had been wrong. They were not the variable. They were the first species to see the true equation, the one that governed not just solar systems or galaxies, but the fate of all light in the endless dark. The planet-sized warship, the Sentinel, was not humanity's ultimate weapon against the Conclave. It was their galaxy's only shield against the coming night. And as the realization settled into the core of his being, Xyler understood. The age of petty empires was over. The age of survival had just begun.